Hello and welcome to another family study through the Gospel of John. I'm Jesse Nelson. I'm the minister of the North City Church of Christ, and today what we're going to do is we are starting John chapter 5. I know after 13 or 14 videos, we are finally in John chapter 5, but what I decided to do, I got into this study, and it's such an awesome book. It's such an awesome chapter, actually. What I want to do first in this video, so I'm not going so long in other videos, so this may be a little bit shorter of a video, is to introduce the outline and the themes of John chapter 5, because I think it's extremely important that you know what's going on before you dig right in. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to outline the book of John. And so what's going to happen here is I'll give you kind of the overview. John is going to heal a man. Okay? He is going to call him to rise up, take his bed. He's sitting in a pool, and he does this work on a Sabbath. And if you know anything about the story of Jesus and the Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders, that Jesus does a lot of things on the Sabbath. But at least for the Gospel of John, this is the first time that we have Jesus performing a miracle on the Sabbath. And John uses this very particularly. He uses this in a certain order, as we're going to see as we get in a little bit later. And and he's going to use it, like I said, for a particular purpose. And the purpose here is to teach us that Jesus himself is equal with God. That's why John is using this specific story with this specific passage. And once again, we got to remember, John is writing these things. I'm going to repeat it almost every lesson. John writes so that you may believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he is the Messiah, and in him you may have life. So everything that we read in the Gospel of John is very important for the purpose of, right? John is different than other gospel writers. He's not just trying to give you the story of Jesus. He's not just trying to tell you what happened. He is picking things out of the life of Jesus. Okay, and John calls these things signs, right? Not necessarily miracles, but signs. These events, teachings, and the miracle that's all performed around is the sign in totality to tell you something about Jesus as the Son of God and or as the Messiah, the Christ, okay? And he wants these things for you to have a deeper faith in Jesus so that you may have eternal life. So in John chapter 5, kind of have it outlined here. And I want to outline it here as kind of a prosecution or Jesus on trial. And one of the reasons why I did that is because the Gospel of John, we looked at, if you go all the way back to the beginning in our introduction and how we outlined it, is Jesus has these series of controversies, okay? He does a work, there's a controversy that comes up, and then there's a conclusion. Okay, and so Jesus' entire life, John wants to show you, Jesus' entire life is on trial. His trial is not just the end of his life, right, at the resurrection. Jesus has been on trial, and Jesus remains on trial throughout his entire life. And Jesus is okay with that. He actually wants people. And what John and Jesus do is they invite people. And that's one of the major aspects of the Gospel of John, is to come and see, right? We looked at the Samaritan woman last week who said, come and see what this man who showed me all the things that I've ever done, come and see for yourself. And they came for yourself, right? The disciples at the very beginning, where we have Andrew and Simon and Nathaniel and Philip, who are all saying, come and see, right? Andrew calls his brother, Philip calls Nathaniel, come and see. We have found the Messiah. We have found the Christ. And the people who actually come to Jesus with a open heart, a good heart, spiritual eyes that are open and are wanting to see Jesus as the Messiah. But there's the other side, right? We'll call them the prosecutors. The Pharisees and Sadducees are trying to discredit Jesus. They're trying to show that Jesus is not who he claims to be. And so this story is very important in that overall discussion of Jesus' confrontation with the religious leaders and how Jesus is going to show an understanding. He's going to show miracles. He's going to show teaching and authority that supersede any rabbi that's ever come before him. Remember, starting in John chapter 2, 3, and 4, Jesus took over 4 major Jewish institutions. Okay, a wedding, right? The temple as a rabbi, and the last one was one as Jacob's well, the wells, right, which were very important. Okay, wedding representing the institution was a very important institution in the Jewish, Jewish life and culture. And Jesus fulfills something; he shows something about himself. Right, that the 6 empty pots he's come to bring fulfillment. The temple, he's come to bring a better temple, to fulfill the temple of God being here on earth. A rabbi, right, he's a better rabbi. He is a rabbi speaking with authority. He's a rabbi who's come from God. Even Nicodemus himself acknowledges that Jesus, you are a man of God, that have come from God, because you couldn't do the works that you're doing that verify your teaching if you were not of God. And then finally, the idea of Jacob's well, which was to bring life to his people, to bring life to Israel. Jesus came to bring life and life eternal from a well that would never go away. Now what we're going to transition into, and we're going to look at this next, is a period where Jesus is going to fulfill or explain, or he's going to upset, in a sense, the human tradition of these things, of major feasts in the life of Israel. But we'll look at that in the next slide. And so what I want to do is, since John is outlining his story, telling his story as if Jesus is on trial, it's kind of like watching Criminal Minds, or it's kind of like watching Law and Order. It always starts off with right, Law and Order, and there's the crime, right? There's the event that happens, and then there's these decisions to either prosecute or arrest, and then Jesus goes on trial and has to defend himself or be prosecuted. And so that's kind of how we have this outline. So the first 15 verses is just the crime, okay? What is happening? There's a man at Bethesda. The man is interrogated right after he's healed. The man himself is interrogated, and the criminal is identified as Jesus, okay? So Jesus is the criminal in this story. Jesus is the one who's going to be on trial. And then the Pharisees kind of get together, and they have a decision to prosecute, right? You have to have enough evidence to prosecute somebody. And their 2 claims are going to be, first, Jesus violates the Sabbath, okay? Sabbath is a weekly festival, the only Jewish weekly festival they have, which would be a day of rest. 6 days they'd work, and on the 7th day, they would rest. You can go read Leviticus or Deuteronomy. Both of those explain more about the Sabbath, okay? And the second basis is that Jesus is making himself equal with God. Not only is he breaking the Sabbath, right, which is a crime within itself in the right religious leader's mind, he's breaking the Sabbath, and Jesus does this often. But he's not just breaking, he's not just going to violate. What he's going to do is he's going to explain the Sabbath. He's going to explain it. He does it in other Gospels, where Jesus would sometimes call himself the Lord of Sabbath. Or he would say that, don't you do these things in the Sabbath? Why can't I heal this man? And then Jesus here is making himself equal to God when he makes the statement that my Father is working and I am working along with him, or I am doing the works of the Father. Basically, the Father is working through me, and he claims to be the Son of God, and they immediately know what he is claiming, right? Jesus knows their thoughts. Jesus knows their teachings. He knows the rabbinic traditions. And so therefore, Jesus is going to cleverly, purposefully state things in such a way where he doesn't have to come out and say, I am God, or I am equal to God. The things he says about himself make the claim for itself. Because there's a lot of people who say, why didn't Jesus ever, actually just come out and say it, right? Why wasn't he just plain as day? Well, if you were a Jew during this time and knew the rabbinic teachings and traditions, you would have understood, you would have looked at what Jesus is saying, and he is making the claims without having to say it. So they're going to prosecute him on that basis. And then finally, Jesus goes on trial, right? 19 through 47 is the trial, right? And most of it is going to be Jesus prosecuting his opponents and challenging their appeal. Okay, and it's going to be one of the longest discourses that Jesus has specifically on his identity. And it's actually very unique to the Gospel of John, what Jesus is going to do here, of how long and the claims that he's going to make so bluntly and I'll say forcefully. Okay, so that's kind of the outline, right? We're going to have the crime. We're going to have Jesus healing the man at Bethesda. He's going to get up. He's going to walk. Be like, wait a minute, who made you walk? It's a Sabbath. They're not as concerned that he healed the man, but they're going to be more concerned with that he picked up his bed and carried it, because that would have broken we call the hedge around the Torah, the hedge laws that they have established. They had to try to make up laws to explain what do not work means, because obviously do not work could be interpreted so many different ways, right? Do not work is technically me picking up this book and carrying it, and maybe I broke a little sweat. Is that work? What if I walk too long, on the Sabbath and I start breaking a sweat? Is that work? Right? What if I see somebody in danger and they're hurting? Can I pick them up? Is that work on Sabbath? Right? Is one of my animals, if they're sick and I need to go to a doctor, can I allow a Jewish doctor to work on the Sabbath? So all these things have to come into consideration. And rather than them looking at it the way Jesus is going to explain it, okay? Jesus is going to explain, and we're going to look at this more next time, okay? When we really get into the meat of this passage, we're going to look at some other Jesus' teachings, and he's going to explain to them, you realize the Sabbath you were not made for the Sabbath. Meaning, the Sabbath is not this eternal principle, and therefore you were made to keep the Sabbath. No. The Sabbath was made for you, okay? The Sabbath was made for you so that you may have a day of rest. So it is supposed to be a blessing. It's supposed to be something that is a gift of God, and they have turned this gift of God into a burden of God. They turned a gift, and God says, go do this. I'm telling you to rest. And yes, sometimes he had to go, listen, I want you to rest. I want to prove to you and to show you. And when it was first established, he was pretty harsh on it. But as it goes, he wanted it to be a day of enjoyment. He wanted it to be a day, and instead, it was a day of people looking behind their back. Is someone going to see if I, the roof caved in at my house and I just had to do a little patchwork, or, my oxen just fell. Is anybody looking? Can I heal it? Can I not heal it? This person's sick. Can I do anything about it? Can I offer remedies? Any kind of those kind of things. It wasn't meant to be this restrictive, burdensome, rule-breaking gift that God gave. It was supposed to be a blessing, a day where you could sit and go, oh man, I've worked for 6 days. I can just rest today. I've made preparations so that today I can just rest. And Jesus is trying to bring it back to what it initially was meant for. Okay, so he's going to do that. So let's look at this next slide here for a moment. This is our last slide, actually. Like I said, this is going to be an introduction. I want it to be 15 or 20 minutes long. This is the start of a new section, by the way. If you go back and you look at our introduction, if you look at how I outlined it, there are major blocks, right? There's overall progression to the story, but then there's major blocks of things that Jesus does. We've already set up that Jesus took down 4 institutions. When I say take down, fulfill, explain, become better than, the wedding, the temple, rabbi, and the well. Now he's going to take 4 of the Jews' major feasts, right? Not all of their feasts. And John's going to use these feasts for a specific reason. And we're going to get into them individually when we get into those sections. But chapter 5 is the Sabbath. And there's going to be an interesting thing here, because Jesus in John chapter 4 is in Galilee. And then in John chapter 6, it says he's on the other side of Galilee. All right. And in John chapter 5, he's in Jerusalem for feast, which is just Sabbath, which you did not have to travel to Jerusalem for the Sabbath. And so what most scholars believe, or I won't say most, what many scholars believe, and what I would tend to lean towards, is that John chapter 5 chronologically does not follow John chapter 4, but thematically and theologically for John, it does. Okay, he's ended a block, and John chapter 6 would be John keeps it chronological when it's okay to. He tries to go boom to boom to boom, but there are times where he kind of flips events, and he flips the events for importance sake. and for a specific reason. And when you look at why John would have the Sabbath first, even before Passover, which Passover is normally the big one that people talk about, but Sabbath is the weekly, okay? Sabbath becomes the pace setter for all the other feasts. And what that is a day of rest. And see, in Leviticus, the first day of the Passover, and the first day of many other feasts, or at least built into other feasts, was this day of rest. These feasts were even supposed to be day of rest, a time to rest, a time to celebrate, a time to thank God, and it was a time of rejuvenation. And the Sabbath was supposed to be a weekly observance of that. And these feasts were supposed to be exaggerated, when you have a whole week, or, the 7 days of unleavened bread, or Passover, then 7 weeks later, Pentecost. They have one in spring and fall and later, all these 3 times they had to go to Jerusalem were supposed to be an entire week of not just resting, but celebrating and rejuvenating. And so the Sabbath becomes the pace keeper for all these other feasts. And Sabbath, once again, was the one that happened more often than the others. Therefore, John's going to tackle it first. It's going to be a whole lot easier for Jesus to do a teaching on the Sabbath. That's why you have so many healings on the Sabbath and so many controversies on the Sabbath. In the gospel accounts, John has this one, but the other gospels have it over and over and over again, is because it happens weekly. And so Jesus can upset the apple cart weekly and learn it or use it as a time to teach, okay? So he's in Jerusalem, which John is very clear that Jesus waits to go to Jerusalem. Some of the feasts he will go, and Passover he'll be there in chapter 7. He'll make the trips. But he doesn't go there unintentionally, and he doesn't go there unless he's not already there. I believe, personally, that this is probably the first. He goes there for a feast, which I think the feast is Passover in John 7, or in chapter 6, not 6. He's going to go there for a Passover, and then this just happens to be a Sabbath on the Passover. When that is, we're going to talk more about that, like I said, when we get into John chapter 5 next week and John chapter 6 again. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to see is we have the Passover, Feast of Tabernacles, or Feast of Booths, and then Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication. Okay, the Feast of Dedication, by the way, is Hanukkah, which is interesting that John chooses Hanukkah, or dedication, because it's a feast that is not found in the Torah. It's a feast that comes much later in Jewish history, but it is a feast that has been practiced for several hundred years, if not longer than several hundred years, up until the time Jesus comes on the scene. Okay? So it's going to be important when we get there. But one of the things this chapter is going to make is 2 major Christological claims. Okay? Christological just means the identity of Jesus, who Jesus is. Okay? And one is Jesus' work is the Father's work, which they are going to take as Jesus saying that he is equal to God. All right? Not necessarily he is God yet, but that he is equal to God. He's in the same playing field as God. And then secondly, that Jesus as the Son of God is the giver of life, which is a role only the Father in their minds should hold. And yet the Father has given it to the Son, which not only makes him equal to God, it makes him God. So both of them kind of do the same thing, but one makes him equal and one makes him not just equal, but the same. Okay? And so Jesus is saying, I am equal to God because I am God. Okay? I am equal to God because I am a part of the Godhead. And John has already made this claim back in John chapter 1. But once again, all those claims in John chapter 1 are expanded on. All those themes are expanded on throughout the gospel. And here's one of those expansions. As in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word was with God. And everything was created by God, right? That Jesus is that Word who became flesh. And now he's making the claim here. He's proving it here. And he's going to have a teaching on it here. And then third is a major hermeneutical claim. Hermeneutical or hermeneutics just means how you study something, how you read something, how you understand something, okay? And you do this in every day, right? When somebody is having a conversation with you, you are using hermeneutics all the time, okay? Let's say you're listening to a phone call conversation that your wife or your husband or your parents are having, and you're trying to find out what is going on. You're listening to one side, and you have to use interpretation to figure out what is the other person saying based upon the responses that are going on the one side that you're hearing. And what is the overall context? Are they friends? Are they talking about some event from a long time ago? Because that means a whole lot. Why are they laughing? Why are they sad? Why are they happy? What event's going on? You're using hermeneutics in everyday life. When you read the newspaper, right? When you watch ESPN, when you look at YouTube videos, all those things, there's a greater context, right? In which you have to place statements and news articles and news video broadcasts, all those things of what's going on. Because if you take our modern day newspapers or modern day, video clippings, and you remove them 2,000 years, let's go back 2,000 years. You have to try to explain, well, this is what COVID-19 is. Well, it's COVID-19. Here's what it was doing. Or here's what, the donkey represents or the elephant represents, the political parties. They may not understand that, political cartoons. And so there's hermeneutics going on in everyday life. And Jesus makes a very strong hermeneutical statement, okay? It's something that I talked about. It's something that I preach often. It's something that we need to understand. Both John and Jesus are inviting us to read or study the story of Israel in a different way. Okay? And we're really going to hone on that when we get there. And the way they do that is in John chapter 5, verse 39. It says, "You search the scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me." Then verse 46, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." This is what's called secular reading, all right, or figurative reading is when you read something in the Old Testament, you cannot fully understand what Moses is saying until the time of Jesus comes. You can only get a limited understanding of the Old Testament because the Old Testament was written for a purpose even greater than what it initially seemed. Temple, sacrifice, priesthood, all those things are explained in Jesus, okay? They're fulfilled in Jesus. But the reverse is also true. You cannot fully understand Jesus. You cannot fully grasp who Jesus as the high priest, as the sacrifice, right? As the body of God, as the king, all these different things that Jesus makes claims to. You can't understand those things unless you read Moses. So you can't have one without the other. You have to have them both cyclically working together. That as you read Moses, you better understand Jesus, but you can't understand Moses unless you understand Jesus. So they're happening together. So I think of Genesis kind of starting here, going, and here's Matthew. You're kind of doing these things, right? Where they're looping and they're interlocking. Whenever Jesus quotes Old Testament, you should go back and read that Old Testament. You should read the entire. You should put it in its timeline, what's going on. Jesus sometimes will make one quotation, but he's really referencing an entire psalm, or he's referencing an entire event in Israel's history. And if you just take the initial quote, the 7 or 8 or 9 words that he uses, and only go back that far, you have failed. And so Jesus is going to make a hermeneutical claim that to understand the new covenant, what Jesus is doing, to understand Jesus himself, you must understand what Moses wrote. Okay? And they use Moses here, and that's the first 5 books of the Torah, which, by the way, is extremely important to understand that because there's very few direct references to Jesus in the Torah. What we mean by direct is like with Abraham 12, which is sort of, you only understand that is speaking of Jesus because of the New Testament. But it's the most direct. It's the most direct without being, this is Jesus in the Torah, is in your seed, Abraham, all nations will be blessed. Because the first interpretation of that is Isaac, right? Isaac is the seed of Abraham. Well, Jesus is the seed in fulfillment, okay? Nobody's blessed through Isaac, really, besides the fact that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 nations bring about Jesus. All right, so it'd be through that lineage. And Jesus, but that's the most direct Or you could go back to John chapter 3, and the seed of woman, right, would crush the head of Satan. Most direct to talking about a Messiah. But all those aren't the only two things in Genesis that reference Jesus, explain Jesus, that all of Genesis, Jesus is saying. All what Moses wrote about in Genesis points to me. All what he writes about in Exodus points to me. All that he writes about in Leviticus points to me. All that he writes about in Deuteronomy points to me. All, right? All of Scripture. All of what Moses wrote. Not just two maybe slight references that you have to try to interpolate. I use that word purposely. But then he'll also in other places say all the law and the prophets speak of me. And it's not just 18 verses that you can kind of string together and, oh, look, that's how they talked about Jesus. It's the entirety of the old law speak about Jesus and prepare us for Jesus in more ways, many times, than just one. So, okay. I know that was a little longer. We got into 26 minutes. That is why I did an introduction by itself. I hope this prepares you for John chapter 5, but not just John chapter 5, but these next 5 chapters. We're going to be really talking about the feasts of Israel, how important those feasts are, and how important it is that Jesus and John use these events or these feasts or these festivals to explain to us more about Jesus. Okay, I'll finish. I hope you have a blessed day. Please read John chapter 5, and I hope to have the next video. I've been having some issues. My computer's being a little slow and delayed. I'm not sure what's going on. It's being overworked probably. But I hope to have this up in the next couple days. If not, we'll just wait till Monday and get the next video up. But God bless, love you, and have a great day.